So welcome to our presentation, Remote Interpreting in Extremis. My name is Myriam Nahon. I have been an interpreter for more than 30 years. I started my career as a civil servant at the SCIC, the Common Service for Interpretation at the European Union, the Commission and the Council. And I have been working as a freelancer for more than 20 years, 10 of which I have been working here in Israel. I'm sitting here with Gisèle Abazon.
Yes, hello. I'm Gisèle Abazon. I'm an interpreter for about close to 30 years. I've made my whole career here in Israel, but working a lot in the European institutions, and I'm part of an international network of consultant interpreters, organizing teams of interpreters all over the world. And I have been also vice president of AIIC, which is the International Association of Conference Interpreters. And that's it. We're going to talk about remote interpreting in extremis, conference interpreting.
Okay, so our presentation will be divided in 4 parts. We will have an intro in which we will explain a little bit about interpretation and remote interpretation. Then we will move on to AIIC guidelines, and we shall end our presentation with the situation nowadays. We're all aware of the pandemic. We all knew the world before and after COVID-19. And so we will speak about the influence of the pandemic in interpretation.
And afterwards, we'll be free, of course, to answer your questions if you have some.
Okay, so AIIC stands for Association d'Interprètes de Conférence, Association Internationale d'Interprètes de Conférence, that is the International Association of Conference Interpreters. As you may know, conference interpreters translate both spoken and signed language in real time. We do so for major international organizations as well as for business clients. That means that we work for international organizations such as the European Union's Commission, the Council, the Parliament, the United Nations agencies, and many other international organizations all over the world. We also work typically for business customers, both at an international level and at a local level. AIIC was founded in 1953, a long time ago, as you can see. It was created to promote the highest standards of quality and ethics in interpretation. It promotes the highest standards at a global scenario. And AIIC does so through many different ways, through professional excellence and working conditions that allow for providing a quality service in terms of interpretation. It advocates for conference interpreters all over the world and for the profession as a whole. And we have in AIIC what we call the Code of Ethics, a code of ethics that allows us to work in a fair manner, providing quality, providing excellence, and making sure that we have the working conditions that allow for that. AIIC has more than 3,200 members that are located all over the world, and is divided into regions. There are large regions in our organization, and there are smaller regions. Israel is one of the smaller regions, and Israiic, you can see the logo on the screen. Israiic is a non-lucrative association that represents the region of Israel. If you would like to have more information regarding the International Association of Conference Interpreters, you may visit aiic.org.
So, interpreting in COVID times has been a whole revolution, as COVID-19 has deeply affected the conference industry and, as a result, the whole interpreting sector. Suddenly face-to-face meetings were replaced by remote meetings, and in situ interpreting was replaced by remote interpreting. AIIC was on its way preparing and checking the possibilities with the new technologies of remote interpreting, but very reluctantly, because it changes completely the mode of working. And suddenly COVID just accelerated things. And although AIIC considers remote interpreting as an in extremis modality, it has made a commitment to develop and adopt working conditions that will allow to provide quality interpreting. Suddenly we were aware of interpreting platforms that sprung and started marketing interpreting services. You can see here on this table different platforms that allow us to work with what we will call soft consoles. That is a real reproduction of what we knew in the real world when we were interpreting in situ. You have here some examples of such platforms, as you may have heard of as VoiceBoxer, Kudo, Interprefy, Interactio, and even iBridge People. All those are platforms or softwares in reality that try to reproduce exactly the platform that we knew in booth in real conferences, and those can be just patched on video conferencing systems existing that you all know. And here the last column is Zoom, which is as such a video conferencing platform that really before COVID had the great idea to add interpreting channels, but that has not all the functions that we need as interpreter. We will not now go into all the technical aspects of each platform, because we really had, in AIIC, we worked a lot testing every platform and checking which is more adapted to our kind of work. For example, the European Parliament decided to work with Interactio, installing Interactio in the premises of the Parliament, so that remote conferencing was made possible through this platform, which is an add-on on the video conferencing system. With Kudo, you can work even in hubs or at home. And Zoom, of course, is what most of us in Israel know. Here you have an image of what those platforms look like. For the interpreters, it's much more comfortable because it really reproduces what we always knew as a console, because we have here buttons to have different language channels, and they have the most important things for us as interpreters, as conference interpreters, and that's the handover function, which is very important because, as you know, when you work in conference interpreting mode, you work in teams of at least 2 per languages, and even more sometimes when the conference are long and there are large combinations of languages. And the handover is one of the most complicated things to do when you're working from home in a mode in extremis, and you have to work from home. So on those soft consoles, you have all those possibilities to change channels, to have what we call relay, which is another function which is important when you have international conferences in many languages. And if you have some languages you have to interpret into, you have to take relay for from another colleague, which is very complicated, although possible, but very complicated on Zoom. And on those platforms which are really dedicated to simultaneous interpretation, you have also the mode of relay, listening to a colleague interpreting, for example, from Arabic into Hebrew, and then you could take from the Hebrew into English. in which you are interpreting. So that is possible on those specific platforms called soft consoles with all those names. So what are the...
Which software did we just see? The bottom screenshot. Which one was that? The black one.
The black one, if I'm not wrong, it is the Kudo one, but I'm not sure. What is Interprefy? That is iBridge, and I think the this one is Kudo, but I'm not sure. Those are screens that I took screenshots, but there are a lot of them. They're in the market. Not all. I mean, the business model of all those platforms is complicated. Sometimes difficult to explain to our customers, which are really happy with Zoom because Zoom doesn't cost anything. And those platforms, of course, are like a technical platform. You have to pay the technician. One of the big advantages of those platforms, of course, for an interpreter is that you have all the time technical help, and you have somebody that is taking care wherever you are of all technical issues that can arise during a conference.
Okay, so what are AIIC's recommendations regarding remote interpreting? As Gisèle said before, even before COVID-19, AIIC was already considering the possibility of working at a distance or remotely. And even then, the preferable option was always to work from a hub. For those who are not aware of what a hub means, it means that it's a place that has been prepared beforehand in order to provide all the interpreting services which are needed. So it is cabled, it is wired, it is equipped with everything that interpreters would need to do their job. So you would typically you would have booths. You would have screens on which you see the conference which is going on in a venue which is remote. You would have consoles, the classical traditional consoles we always use in situ conferencing. And you would have the appropriate connection. You would have all the technical issues would be solved by the hub organizer. And as an interpreter, you would go to the hub and sit in your booth, and you would provide interpretation as you would in any traditional conference. The difference being that the conference is being held somewhere else, and you would see it through a screen instead of looking through the booth glass and seeing the conference in front of you. So always preferable to work from a hub rather than to work from home. Now, why is that? Hubs are isolated from the venue, that's true. You would be working remotely, which is not a positive thing. As you may know, when you see things on a screen, it's not the same as seeing things by yourself, being in the place, seeing what's going on around, and being able to communicate with everyone at the conference. So you are isolated from the venue. But on the other hand, you're sitting next to your colleague, like Gisèle and I are sitting right now. So you can help each other, you can cooperate, you can pass the microphone, as we call it, hand over the interpretation to your colleague, him sitting next to you. If you do have a problem, for example, you start coughing, you can again pass the interpretation on to your colleague. Everything is much easier, and you don't have to deal with any technical issues. The only thing you need to do when you go to work from a hub, when you go to work in a conference, is to interpret, which is what we know. This is what we do best, and it is difficult enough as it is to have to deal with other technical issues. So a hub would be taking care of everything that is technical. It would provide interpreters with everything they need to work properly, but the interpreters would be sitting in a booth as they would in a normal conference. What happens if you work from home? You are isolated from the venue as you would in a hub, but at the same time, you're isolated from your colleague. You would be sitting at your home and your colleague would be sitting at their home, and you would need to have a parallel communication channel in order to make sure that the handover is done seamlessly, for example. Or you would have to make sure that your colleague can see if you have a problem so that you can hand over the interpretation to your colleague. You would have to deal with all the technical issues, and believe me, there are many more than it seems at first hand. We will be speaking now about all the different things that you have to take into account if you work from home. As I said, working from home is not a very good idea, but if you need to do it in extremis, then you should take into account 3 different aspects of it.
Okay, so working from home is very, very tiring and complicated, and you have to take into account, first of all, your working environment. You have to be sure that you have a quiet room meaning that you have to take care in advance that you are enough isolated from outside noise, for example, and that nothing can be interfering in the quality of sound you need. Second thing, you have to take care of a stable cable internet connection. No Wi-Fi whatsoever. Wi-Fi is never stable enough. You cannot work with a connection that is not an Ethernet connection. You have to be wired and connected by cable. And you have also to take care of a backup internet connection. That's very important because you never know what can happen. I personally, here in my studio that I have built through that terrible year we lived, I have 2 internet cable connections, so that if one computer goes down with my first connection, I have a second one ready here to be there as a backup. And you have to have also, if you don't have a second internet connection, cabled connection, I repeat, that's very important, no Ethernet, no Wi-Fi whatsoever. You need also, and you can also have a backup connection using your smartphone as a hotspot. That's always if there is a power failure or something like that, then the hotspot on your smartphone can always be a possible backup. Now, you have to have also proper equipment as hardware with a fast computer or laptop. That's for sure with minimum requirements. I must say, if you work with all the platforms that I cited before, they will give you a checklist of all the requirement of hardware you need to have in your laptop or computer. You need to have an extra screen, so not only having your laptop and, if possible, an extra laptop for security, but also a second screen, because you have to have enough screen to be able to consult documents, glossaries, and make internet search during the conference. You have at the same time to see properly the conference you are interpreting. So you have to have the best view possible of the presenter, because, you know, one of the things that are very difficult in remote is that you don't have all the body language and communication that you have with a conference when you are in situ and seeing the presenter and the speaker. And you need another screen. Most of the time we use our smartphone to communicate with your booth mate. When you're working on Zoom, for example, you have to have on your smartphone a WhatsApp or whatever communication you choose to be able to communicate with your booth mate. So that's a lot of screens, and that's really, really difficult to manage, but that's imperative if you want to work from home. You have to have also a proper equipment as headset and microphones. This is critical. First of all, your headset has to be a USB headset, because you have to protect yourself of audio shocks that happened very often when you work remotely. You can find on our site a list of recommended headsets. Here I have, for example, it's a Sennheiser, which is verifiable, but always with an USB connection. That's critical. Not using small headsets that you use for your phone. That's not enough. The quality of the microphone is not enough. The quality of the sound is not enough. Here I have the mixer. So we are listening to the conference with our small headphones, and I have here a microphone, which is a table microphone of high quality, and I hope that my sound is good enough. But for conference interpreting, you can also use this kind of headsets, but always connected through USB, because really, really, you have to take care of your ears. That's your most important asset, and you have to take care. And there are a lot of reports of accidents, of really incidents as audio shocks, because the quality of sound on remote conferencing is really problematic, because of question of compressions and all kind of technical issues that make it really hazardous to work properly and have good enough sound for interpreting. People do not understand enough that it's not enough that you hear well. You have to hear well enough to speak at the same time you are listening. So it's really important you have a very good headset, and on this at the same time a very good mic to be properly heard. And of course, one of the things you have to take into account when you work from home is all the questions of liabilities. When you talk to your clients, you have to tell him from the beginning that you are not responsible working from home if anything happens because of technical problems. If suddenly there is a fall of power, or if your internet is down for a moment, or any technical problem, you should not be liable to the interruption of service due to data loss. Another question, if your client is not providing you good enough sound, meaning if the speakers are not well enough equipped to give you proper sound to interpret, you are you should be authorized to stop interpreting, having told your client in advance that you cannot interpret with any kind of sounds. I, for example, had once a conference with very high level people, and one of the parliamentarians that was talking from his car. So the sound was absolutely impossible. And so I had to tell my client, I'm very sorry, but it's not a proper mic. I cannot possibly go on interpreting because I can't hear enough. So all those things are very important, that you have a proper setting if you have to work from home. All those things have to be prepared in advance and well thought of.
Okay, so if you're working from home, those are the things that you have to take into account. As Gisèle said, you need a backup setting. You may have noticed that there are 2 windows in this conference that are named Israiic. That's our backup. That is, if we were interpreting now and this connection fell, we would be able to continue interpreting from the other connection that we have set. So that's an example of what Gisèle was talking about. And I cannot insist enough on the importance of quality of sound. Now, sound quality is something that depends on many things. It depends on the microphone that the speaker is using to begin with. It depends on the connection. it depends on the earphones that you're using as an interpreter. So we have to make sure that we are well prepared. And even then, in some occasions, as Gisèle explained with this person who was a speaker from his car, it makes it impossible. You have to take into account that sound quality has to be much better than that, than the one needed by the audience. That is, someone who is listening to a conference needs a certain quality of sound, but someone who is interpreting a conference needs a very good quality sound, because you're talking at the same time as you are listening, and therefore there's an interference. If the quality is not good enough, it makes it really, really difficult to interpret. Okay, so we were working from home. Now we're going to give you recommendations regarding working in remote interpretation in a hub. So if you do want to work effectively, you must make sure that the hub is well equipped. And by well equipped, I mean that you're sitting together with your colleague. In certain countries, and if you're not yet vaccinated, you may be working in parallel booths. You may have a glass between the two colleagues that are working together, but at least you can see each other. You can sign one to the other. You can hand over. You can see, you can explain that you have a sound problem and that you want the person to hand over. So you have to make sure that the hub is properly set up. You need to have a technician around for the whole duration of the conference. It's not enough that he's there in the beginning and he's sure that everything is working properly and then he goes away. He needs to be there and listening throughout the whole conference. If you're using interfaces that are based on software, you have to make sure that you have the same basic functionalities everywhere, so that there are had a technical briefing. You have to make sure that you are well acquainted with the platform that you're going to use for the conference, and you have to be compensated accordingly for your time if you're given a technical briefing in advance. So up until now, we have given you recommendations for remote interpreters, tips for interpreters, so to speak. But if you're going to interpret at a conference, you want to make sure that your speakers know what they have to do so that you can then interpret them. So let's talk now about tips for speakers. AIIC has gathered the experience of more than 3,000 interpreters all over the world in order to draft this leaflet that you can see here, the tips for speakers for virtual multilingual meetings with simultaneous or consecutive interpretation. They did so in English in the beginning, and we have made sure that we have translated those into many different languages. Here you have them in Hebrew, for example. So going back to English, what do speakers have to do? Remember we spoke about broadband and Ethernet cable? Well, your speakers also have to be connected through the Ethernet. They have to have a cable connection because a Wi-Fi connection will not provide a good quality sound. It may have interferences. You may remember how often people are frozen and then you can't hear them for a few seconds and then you hear them again and they're frozen again. So you want to make sure that they have a good connection, a stable cable connection. They have to use an external and quality plugged in microphone. So once again, you need to plug in your microphone with a USB, not in any other way. That is the only way you will get high quality sound. Not only as an interpreter, but as a speaker, you need to have a proper microphone. You need to control your environment. I'm sure that we all remember these images where you're watching the news and then interviewing someone who's very important and suddenly the door opens and the 3-year-old child comes in and jumps on top of the person, and you know it's all very nice, but you want to make sure that there are no interruptions. You want to make sure that you have a quiet environment. You want to make sure that you won't be interrupted, but you won't have sounds in your house that may hinder the quality sound.
I think it's a very interesting point, also the number 4 that you have here, just going quickly. It's the question of the camera and what you see on the screen. And many speakers don't take into account that the body language, the lip reading will really help interpreters to better understand and connect to what the speaker is saying. So it's important that you take in the speakers, of course, it's what you tell to your client, that he has to take into account that who is speaking is filmed well enough so that we can have a minimum of eye contact, of feeling as if we were there to see him in person. And the same with lighting. I mean, you can take into account that you have to be in front of the light so that you are seen at your best, and we can have more information with having a proper image. Another point that is very important is sharing all documents and presentations with the interpreter. It is, of course, trivial for us to know that in the real world, we always are nudging our clients, please send us the presentations, we have to know what we're talking about, we have to prepare ourselves properly, but most of it, it's also true for remote interpretation. So all those tips for speakers are really, really important, and that's a very interesting document we have prepared in AIIC so that our clients know what we need to give them a proper service. To schedule a rehearsal with the interpreters can be also a very, very good idea. When you have such a rehearsal, people can get the sense of what it is to work in a remote situation. So also the speakers and the interpreters can familiarize themselves with your speaking style, with the client speaking styles. And so we can really prepare better before the big day of the conference.
Only the speaker's microphone should be open. Well, we all know that, right? This is not just about interpretation, it's about any remote conferencing. You don't want to hear other people at the same time as the speaker because it's an interference for the interpreters and it makes our work even harder than it is. And of course, ask your speaker to state which language he or she will be using. This will allow participants to decide whether they can listen to the original channel or whether they have to switch into the interpreting channel. Okay, so these are the same tips that we have mentioned before in Hebrew. If you'd like to receive the guidelines for speakers in English or in Hebrew, you are most welcome to contact us at Israiic@aiic.net.
So those tips for speakers are really can really be helpful to communicate better with your clients. I mean, the thing is that many people have not a clue what is interpreting in the meanings of what is needed for an interpreter to do his work properly and at his best. So it is absolutely clear that it's always preferable to work from a hub. But having lived through that year where we had no choice but working remotely from home, in extremis, you have to be sure that you are well prepared to provide remote interpreting services, meaning taking care of your environment and, of course, telling your clients that they have to work also from a proper environment and not talking. I mean, another anecdote was I had also that conference with the mayor of a city in Israel that was talking to an international audience, but it was so easy because it was on Zoom, you know. So he was talking on Zoom and giving his presentation while he was walking on a market. So the noise around and he was, you know, and he was supposed to be interpreted. And he was very, very annoyed when we told him, we're very sorry, but we can't do that. And so you have really to take care of your environment, but also of the environment of your clients, and using those tips for speakers so that you don't have this kind of surprise of somebody talking from a market or from a noisy environment. Your hardware and everything that is related to technical issues has to be very well checked, and you have to make sure that liabilities are really clear in your contract with your clients, so that you have absolutely no responsibility. You decline any responsibility of technical issues when you're working from home. That's really paramount. You have to make sure your customer is aware that remote interpreting is not easier, but much, much harder than traditional interpreting, because it is really very tiring. I don't know, I know that every one of us has experienced a lot of remote conferencing, and you all know that after 2 hours on screen, you are completely exhausted. So interpreting is really, really tiring remotely, much more than in situ again. And all the technical issues are a real supplement of stress, which we have also to manage and to take into account.
So before and after COVID-19, don't we all hope to get back to the way things were before the pandemic? Well, remote interpreting is not ideal. As I said before, it has too many negative features to it. There's a lack of personal communication, both with customers, with your audience, with your colleagues. It involves many technical issues that you wouldn't have to take care of if you were working in situ. But nevertheless, remote interpreting is here to stay, and it does have its benefits as well. For example, organizations that did not use interpretation before the pandemic are now well aware of its benefits. And so organizations that would never have interpretation, even after the pandemic, after we go to in situ interpretation, back to in situ interpretation, we will continue having organizations that cannot afford to organize in situ events, but they do want to share their ideas. They want to grow together with their members or with their customers. Organizations that met once a year face-to-face will continue to do so after the pandemic, but they will also meet in between remotely. I have been working with different organizations who have realized suddenly that they can be in touch with their customers, their members, whoever they organize the conferences for. They can share their ideas. They can be continuously in touch. They can check whether what they're doing is going in the right direction. So even if they go back to face-to-face meetings, they will keep having these remote meetings many times a year. Okay, so let's do our best to provide professional interpreting services also when we do so remotely. AIIC has always tried to provide the standards for quality interpretation before the pandemic, and it is striving to do so throughout the pandemic and hopefully after the pandemic. So if you receive an offer to work remotely, feel free to contact us. We will be more than happy to share the experience that we have gathered in AIIC. You have here our email, israiic@aiic.net. You can feel free to contact us. We wanted to leave some time for questions and answers. So we're more than ready to listen to your comments or your questions. And of course, thank you very much.
I have a question. It's, as you said, organizations that weren't using interpretation before are maybe now aware of the advantages. Also, it's now obviously less expensive to have interpretation because you don't have to fly the interpreters all over the world and pay for travel and accommodation. So the question is, have you actually seen, maybe sort of in the second half of the pandemic so far, has there actually been an increase in demand?
I would say that in theory, it's true that you could, I mean, it could be very good for small languages as Hebrew, because really, in reality, for small languages as Hebrew, for example, it is interesting that international organizations could really have, international organization could really have small languages for short periods of times. And so for a specific conference, it could have Hebrew for an hour or 2 hours, and not having to fly interpreters for that specific conference could be good. So I think that it has been a specific growth for some conferences, but I'm not sure we could, I mean, most of our colleagues are just complaining because they have less work. I mean, for the time being, it's not, many conferences were cancelled, and we didn't get as much work then as we were before. But I suppose that back when the work will be going back to normality, and we will have hybrid events where the conference will take place in person, and then they will have add-ons of small languages, for example, from remote. And that's, I think, a development that we could see in the next year. But that last year was absolutely not favorable to that.
I wonder whether AIIC could in fact do marketing so that organizations are aware of the possibility of having interpreters. Maybe companies or organizations or associations that it never occurred to them to have interpretation, and now when it can be done sort of more cheaply, maybe they would consider it, but it's just something they never thought about before.
Well, believe me, big organizations are used to interpretation, and they have all had to think how to do interpretation without the interpreters in situ, and even without the participants in situ. So they're well aware of that. Where regarding smaller organizations, I think that everybody is aware of the fact that you can hold a virtual meeting nowadays, and it's quite effective. And most organizations, even the smaller ones, are aware of the possibility to have interpretation. So after the pandemic, we believe we will have hybrid events. So if you need an exotic language interpreter or a team of interpreters for a few hours, you will not fly them over. You will use probably remote interpretation together with the in-situ interpretation that you have for the languages that you have in the city where the event is held. Say, for example, you have an event in Paris and you have interpreters in situ that you don't have to fly in, okay, for English, French, Spanish, Italian, German, but you don't have Hebrew. So perhaps you will have the Hebrew interpreters sitting in Israel in a hub, I hope, interpreting from a distance. So you will have hybrid meetings. Gila had a question, yes.
Okay, I think that the expansion of interpreting is this question I want to put to AIIC, because most of the expansion of interpreting has been not in the occasional meetings that I do, for example, but in the humanitarian and in the community interpreting fields, where often there is difficulty in setting up the required infrastructure, and the people who need the services don't have access or good access to internet. So how is AIIC relating to the massive expansion of remote interpreting across the world and in Israel in legal and medical and other situations? Because AIIC's very fixed on the this is the day rate, and this is what we do, and the requirements and the general the human resources used in community interpreting, which also needs to be highly professional, they're very different.
Okay.
And AIIC has stayed out of this for a long time because it doesn't meet their dogmatic, square.
Well, it's not a question of dogma, it's a question of professional. We are an association of conference interpreters. That's our profession. Community interpreting, court interpreting is a different profession, okay? So first of all, our profession is conference interpreting, which is a very specific profession. Community interpretation, when you are accompanying people in all kind of personal settings, in emergency, what is community interpreting is another set. And as I always say, it's like in translation and interpretation. Conference interpreting, a conference interpreter generally is able also to work as a community interpreter or as a translator, while the contrary is not true. Okay, so not always true. I mean, of course, but meaning that to do community interpreting, you don't have to be member of AIIC, because all the settings that are needed in a conference interpreting setting are completely different. Now, we are trying in the pandemic period to help as much as we can in all kind of settings, and through the world, the whole world, all AIIC members, we're working in all kind of situations that were needed, but those are not, that's not our main profession. So that maybe can answer the question. I can tell you that we lately we had in AIIC added to its profession sign language interpretation for conferences. That's exactly the same. Our colleagues in sign language had to find the whole possible settings for interpreting in remote conferences. Of course, all those sign language interpreters are also working as community interpreters, and then the settings and the needs are different. But of course, the remote interpreting research and settings that we have set can be very useful also for community interpreting and also for court interpreting, which is, of course, a different branch of the profession.
So I'd like to insist on the fact that everything that AIIC has developed in terms of working conditions, standards, recommendations are good enough for any kind of interpretation. As a matter of fact, of course, for conference interpretation, that's why that's the setting for which they were developed. But they're good for any kind of interpretation. If you are going to work in a community setting, but you're going to work remotely, you will want your speakers to be aware of all the things that we have mentioned before. You will want to make sure that you have the setting that will allow you to provide a good quality interpretation, whether it is community or conference. So most of the recommendations that we have given are recommendations that are to be implemented in any setting, where may be community, medical, or legal interpretation. But yes, the distinction that Gisèle made is very important. Our remit, our mandate, and our organization, the organization that we represent, is an organization of conference interpreters. It does not mean that it's not higher, lower, better, or worse. It's just a different profession. Exactly in the same way as translation is different from interpretation.
Thank you. Yes, that's more or less what I wanted to ask you about, because I've been hearing, how difficult it is to get counselling, interpreting services by phone when internet isn't available and stuff like that, and how difficult it is to find rare language interpreters who are competent to do that.
True.
They have to be highly skilled.
Yes, yes.
Absolutely.
Like Albanian, for example.
Absolutely. No, that's one of the problems, is that in community interpreting, most of the time rare languages are necessary, and because I think of foreign workers, foreign people stuck here in extreme difficulties, and sometimes they really need the help of a professional, which is difficult to find. And I think that the pandemic brought to us the possibility, because, for example, in AIIC, I can today find interpreters working remotely from all languages you can imagine, because it's not a problem. I don't have to fly anyone. So if you have a proper setting, I have today, and that's the advantage of AIIC, of course, because we are a world association. I can today, and I did actually give services in Turkish or Japanese or Chinese here in Israel, because I had a colleague, and I could find a colleague, and I knew, being it a member of AIIC, that he was a proper interpreter, able to do the job properly and remotely, which is, well, it just added, it added more difficulties, and at the same time it opened a whole new world of communication with different languages that are rare languages.
Yes, I'd like to stress that, because we're in Israel here, we speak Hebrew, and Hebrew is what we call a rare or an exotic language, in the sense that it's a minority language. There aren't many people in the world that speak it. And the good thing about remote interpretation is that these smaller or minority languages will be able to be heard and used and interpreted in many more conferences than they used to. So that's a very good thing. And the fact that our organization is a worldwide organization means that we will be able to provide the services for those minority languages all over the world. So that's good news. There is a good side to the developments in terms of remote interpretation, even if we know that being in situ, being at a conference or at an event, makes interpretation much easier for us. We are well aware of the setting. We can even speak to the speakers before they go on stage, which makes a huge difference. We can go to them and ask them for a specific term that we couldn't find in any other way. We may be able to ask them questions regarding their presentation that weren't clear to us. So and we can speak to the other colleagues before the meeting. We can share glossaries, perhaps we can share ideas. So in situ is the best. If you don't have the choice, then go to a hub if you can do that. And if you have to work from home, at least make sure that you're doing it properly.
Is there actually a hub in Israel for interpreting?
No,
no.
We are.
Or perhaps not yet.
No, not yet. So we're trying. No, I know. No, I mean, what we have here is what we call ad hoc hubs, meaning that for a specific conference, I had a conference at the Weizmann Institute, so they just built, so the conference was absolutely remote with people all over the world, and in the institute, we built an ad hoc hub, meaning that I had a technician who was responsible, we had the booth, and we could work from an ad hoc hub, okay? And you can have, and we had that in many other conferences that built for on their premises booth and an ad hoc hub. We don't have, and I'm not sure we will have, what they call a hub out there abroad, meaning a hub that is, you know, all the time there, where you have 10 booths and you can provide, it's like a call center. That they have, and that's the bad side of the situation, that big cities having a lot of interpreters like London, Brussels, Paris, where they have all the languages you want and all the interpreters that are needed. If they have a hub, they have a call center where the interpreters are going to work in the morning, doing in the morning a medical conference in Beijing, and in the afternoon a conference about agriculture taking place in Dubai, and they are doing it from Paris. And that's a very, very, very worrying development that will be complicated, because here in Israel we cannot have a hub because we couldn't populate it to have it running and going, because we don't have enough interpreters to serve international conferences with so much people. But on the other hand, the problem with those fixed hubs that they are going to take away a lot of work of the small regions like ours.
Yeah, but ad hoc hub, the fact that a hub is not permanent, the fact that it's an ad hoc hub does not mean that it doesn't work. It works perfectly well as long as you have everything that you need. You have the booths, you have the console, you have your colleague next to you, and you have a technician that's there to do his job. So the fact that it's not a permanent is not it's not needed really. Not in a country where we don't have enough work to justify having a permanent hub with overheads and so on and so forth.
Thank you.
Okay.
Just may I?
Yes, Eliezer.
Okay. First of all, thank you, and as usual, very informative and very good. I would like to say just a couple of things. First of all, Gisèle, the Zoom version that you need in order to have interpreting channels is the paid one, so it's not free.
Of course, it isn't. No, but I mean it's free in terms of costs. It's really the cheapest version because for 400,
of course,
yeah, for 400 bucks a year, you have the interpretation option, and you can, and all the consoles are $400. 2 hours. So I mean, it's a real difference.
Yeah, indeed, but
yes.
It's not free.
No, of course.
It was probably implied by what you said. About the technical requirements. One of the things, and again, you cannot stress enough the importance also of rehearsal, because as you said, Myriam, there are so many variables that influence the quality of the sound. It's not only the earphones or the USB connector, it's also sometimes the distance of the mic from your mouth, specific for the person that modulates the voice. So rehearsal with the proper setting is crucial sometimes, and you need it. And again, sometimes it's part of the budgeting, sometimes it is not.
But rehearsal, but Eliezer, rehearsal also gives you the opportunity to explain all the tips for speakers to your speakers, because if you're going to rehearse with them, then you can make them aware of everything they have to do so that you can do your job.
Yes, but in my case, most of the rehearsals were with the organizers and not with the speakers themselves.
Oh, but again, you can even if the speakers are not there, since you have a rehearsal, that gives you the opportunity to make the organizers aware of the fact that perhaps they should send the tips for speakers. Perhaps they could read them before the conference begins, a few minutes before the conference begins. It's just another opportunity.
Right, and another thing is that about the overload, and sometimes it's even for the listeners as well. It's not only for the interpreter. Sometimes you need, as part of the setting, having an extra time in order to explain the people how to use the virtual console as a listener, not as an interpreter. And you have to do it in several languages. And here it is the first minutes of a conference sometimes are the problematic part, that many people say it's not working, and they leave. And that's another issue. And the last one is, well, you said about the overload. It's again, when you mentioned that, you forgot to mention one thing, and probably because you are very Europe centered, but sometimes working with Latin America and the difference of time with several time zones means that I have to interpret 3 o'clock in the morning.
True. Yes, it's true.
Yeah, if you work done that.
If you
and still have to work and function the next day. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right.
Yeah,
Okay.
you have to take into account the load, the cognitive load of working remotely is very, very hard. It is technically and physically very demanding, and I think that our colleagues, sometime you're talking about working at night. So if you take one assignment that is going to be at 3 o'clock in the morning, then you don't take another assignment on the next day, because you can't do that. You don't do that to your client and to yourself, because the price is too high to pay.
I fully agree, but sometimes, you know, especially when you work with rare languages,
yeah, I know,
specific niches, you have to, and yeah, you cannot explain exactly why working at noon is such an overload, because nobody forces you to work at 3 o'clock in the morning, of course. But yeah, that's and again, thank you very, very much, and as usual, a pleasure.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.